Well, hello then, I do hope you're all well. I shall be brief. QC and SNP MP Johanna Cherry was invited as a guest to the Home Affairs Cross-Party Select Committee about asylum and immigration, and to ask our hapless Tory MP, Tom, nice but dumb, about his third sandwich of a Rwanda agreement. And let's just say Johanna Cherry annihilated him and this ridiculous Rwanda agreement. So much so, she asks him a very, very important question and basically proves that this deal with Rwanda isn't worth the paper it's written on. Enjoy.
Okay, it was remiss of me at the beginning not to welcome Johanna Cherry, who is a member of the Human Rights Committee and is guesting with us today. So I'm now going to move to Joanna to ask some questions.
Thank you very much.
Well, that should be interesting then.
Chair, and thank you for having me. Good morning, Minister. The US State Department, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have all reported evidence in 2020-21 of unlawful or arbitrary killings, forced disappearances and torture committed by the Rwandan government. Do you accept the evidence that these acts have been committed by the Rwandan government?
The point that I would make is that overall, Rwanda is a safe and secure country for the resettlement of individuals. I think it is noteworthy that Rwanda is committed to the convention. I think it is noteworthy that, for example, the UNHCR, through the transit mechanism, have been working with the Rwandan government to place refugees in Rwanda. I think you yourself would recognise the expertise that the UNHCR has in these matters. And I think it's key to just point out that, of course, through the CPIT report, it is a comprehensive report. There is no systematic breaches of human rights obligations.
Well, that doesn't really answer my question. My question was, do you accept the evidence set out by the US State Department, one of our major allies, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, both very internationally respected NGOs? Do you accept the evidence that there have been unlawful or arbitrary killings in Rwanda, forced disappearances and torture committed by the Rwandan government? Do you or do you not accept that evidence?
We have been very clear through the CPIT report in setting out various concerns that have been raised internationally around those sorts of issues, but I go back to the point that fundamentally we do not believe that there are systematic breaches of human rights in a way that would mean that this policy would be inappropriate.
It's not what your Foreign Office says, Tom.
And how have you reached that review? How have you reached that view? I mean, what assessment have you made that leads you to believe that asylum seekers who are removed to Rwanda will not face the potential of human rights breaches? What work have you done to counter the evidence that come from the US State Department and the other organisations that I mentioned?
What I can tell you is that I know that the work of the country teams in drawing up this sort of guidance is considered to be authoritative by the courts and thoroughly professional and high quality. That report is clear that there is no systemic breach, and I'm content that that work has been carried out thoroughly and appropriately. And I again make the point that, for example, the UNHCR, who you yourself have regularly cited as being authoritative on these matters, place refugees in Rwanda through the transit mechanism, which I think demonstrates that there is a broad consensus around that finding in the report.
You're very focused on saying that there's no systemic evidence, but my specific question to you was whether you recognise the evidence set out by the US State Department, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and whether you have carried out yourself any assessment to satisfy yourselves that there aren't human rights breaches in Rwanda.
So I am satisfied overall, and I think that it's right that that CPIT report is candid, that does set out various instances that have been raised in international fora and by other countries, and that we look at this in the round. I would argue that at the core of this policy is our determination that we must live up to our international obligations through both the Convention and ECHR, and of course it is crucial that the Rwandans live up to their human rights obligations too.
You mentioned the United Nations a moment ago. The UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture have noted a refusal by Rwanda to cooperate with them. Do you think that indicates any problem with adequately assessing the risk of breaches of Article 3?
If you're one of these refugees and you're going to be sent on a plane to Rwanda, that won't fill you with much confidence, will it?
For asylum seekers in Rwanda.
So Rwanda will process claims in accordance with the UN Refugee Convention, national international human rights laws, and will ensure protection from inhuman and degrading treatment or being returned to the place that individuals originally fled.
I'm going to
this.
ask you some questions about what we can do if Rwanda doesn't do that in a minute. But what I specifically asked you there was, do you think that Rwanda's refusal to cooperate with the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture indicates any problem with adequately assessing the risk of human rights breaches, particularly Article 3 in Rwanda?
So I would refer you to my earlier answer that the Rwandans, as are we, determined to live up to our international obligations.
Do I take it from that you're not concerned that Rwanda has refused to cooperate with the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture? That doesn't concern the British government?
What I would say is that as a UK government, we have proper and thorough engagement with our international partners and with those international bodies. And I would, of course, encourage countries around the world to have similar constructive dialogue.
I'm going to read you something that the US State Department...
See that face he pulled there right at the end when he finished? I don't think he believes anything he says is true. I think he's just talking absolute twaddle, and he knows he is.
...have said about Rwanda, and it's a quote. The Rwandan government was often intolerant of public reports of human rights abuses and suspicious of local and international human rights observers, and it often impeded independent investigations and rejected criticism as biased and uninformed. Individuals who contributed to international reports on human rights reported living under constant fear that the government could arrest and prosecute them for the contents of their work, end quote. Now that comes, as I said, from the US State Department, our major ally. Do their findings about the Rwandan government's attitude towards human rights observers concern you at all?
I think this is where, for example, the joint committee arrangement that I've just commented on is significant in terms of satisfying ourselves as a UK government that all of the aspects of the partnership are being upheld in the way that we would all want to see. And I make the point again that the Rwandans, rather like we are committed and determined to act in accordance with those international obligations. And I'd just add that in terms of the Joint Committee, it will determine the process for access to facilitate and ensure that the monitoring committee formed in accordance with paragraph 15 has unfettered access to the following for the purposes of completing their assessments and reports. The locations they are required to inspect under their terms of reference, save that a relocated person may refuse them entry to their private accommodation if they do not wish it to be inspected. Relevant officials, employees and agents of both participants for interview, any other person they may wish to interview who is willing to be interviewed, the records held in relation to relocated individuals at all stages of the relocation process from the initial screening by the United Kingdom up to and including the asylum process, as well as records of decisions taken about them, records of grants and refusals of refugee status and of appeals raised against refusals of refugee status and their outcome, records of any procedures that directly impact relocated individuals, and records of all complaints made by relocated individuals and the outcome. So I would argue that there is proper scrutiny around these arrangements that has been formalised or is being formalised through the establishment of these committees that will allow...
Conclusive proof, Tom Persglove can read.
...allow us to satisfy ourselves that things are being dealt with in a way that we believe to be fitting of the partnership.
Okay. What happens if the monitoring committee or the joint committee find out that there are human rights breaches in Rwanda in relation to these asylum seekers that we've sent there? What recourse or remedy or penalty will there be?
I'm not going to speculate on hypotheticals.
It's not a hypothetical.
But of course, well, it is a hypothetical.
It's a hypothetical, but it's a very important question as to enforcement, because I'm asking you about how the human rights of these people that we're going to deport to Rwanda will be protected. And you're putting great store by the monitoring committee or the joint committee. And what I'm saying to you is, if the monitoring committee or the joint committee find that there have been human rights breaches in relation to asylum seekers sent there, what recourse or remedy will there be for those asylum seekers under the agreement you've reached with Rwanda? Well, so it's a question of enforcement, Minister. It's really important.
Yes. So you will recognise that this is a memorandum of understanding, which means that either party has the ability to be able to terminate that agreement accordingly.
It's not binding under international law, is it?
That's correct.
So what happens if Rwanda doesn't comply with its obligations either under the Memorandum of Understanding or the Refugee Convention, or acts in a way that would be contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights? I mean, is this Memorandum of Understanding worth the paper it's written on from the point of view of enforcement if your high hopes for human rights protections in Rwanda are not realised?
So I believe
That is scary, innit? You're on a plane to Rwanda as a refugee, and you find out that this new policy they want is not an international law, so to speak. I would be absolutely shitting bricks.
it is worth the paper it's written on, but it would of course be for the British government and ministers to decide what was appropriate in those circumstances.
What about the individuals? What about the men and women, including, as I see, and I'm going to ask you about this in a minute, same-sex attracted people and transgender people that we're planning on deporting to Rwanda? We'll come on to that in a minute. What about these men and women?
This isn't deportation, just to be very clear.
These people. Let's not quibble about that. We're going to send these asylum seekers to Rwanda, and you're satisfied that Rwanda is not a country that abuses human rights. But what happens if you're wrong? How do these individuals enforce their rights if their human rights are breached? So, for example, if a lesbian who's sent to Rwanda finds herself being discriminated against or abused on the grounds of her same-sex attraction, there's no anti-gay discrimination laws in Rwanda, so how does she enforce her rights?
So there is, of course, a non-discrimination law that runs right through everything that is done in Rwanda. That is a key concept of their laws and their constitution, and I think that's a welcome thing. I would just make the point, I'd go back to this point, I've made it previously, but it is important in this regard that nobody will be relocated, and to be clear, this isn't deportation, because deportation relates to foreign criminals. What we will have is a situation where individuals will only be relocated to Rwanda if it is safe and appropriate for them. And that is an appropriate safeguard that will see cases screened on an individual case-by-case basis, taking into account all of the relevant circumstances. And as I said, in the Rwandan asylum system, people will be processed if they wish to enter the Rwandan asylum system, and they will have access to legal advice as part of that.
Have you seen the Foreign Office travel advice for Rwanda?
Yes.
And have you seen that it says, and I quote, "Individuals can experience discrimination and abuse, including from local authorities. There are no specific anti-discrimination laws that protect LGBT individuals in Rwanda." That's right, isn't it? That's what we advise British people travelling to Rwanda.
So it is fair to say that Rwanda is one of the safest countries in the world in terms of
I'm asking
crime.
you a specific question because a moment ago you told us there were anti-discrimination laws in Rwanda, and I was asking you particularly about same-sex attracted people and transgender people. But your government's...
Again, I go back to the point that people will not be relocated if it is unsafe for them.
Your government's Foreign Office travel advice advises LGBT British citizens that are planning to go to Rwanda that there are no specific anti-discrimination laws that protect LGBT individuals and that they may experience discrimination and abuse, including from local authorities. So how does that sit with what you just told me a moment ago?
There is an anti-discrimination law that runs through the constitution of Rwanda like a stick of rock. And again, I would make the point that cases will be judged on a case-by-case basis as to whether it is appropriate and safe for those individuals to be removed to Rwanda.
I get that. I get that you're going to do it on a case-by-case basis. And my colleague, Mr. MacDonald, asked you some questions about how thorough your assessments were going to be. But what I'm asking you now is this. If you've determined after your case-by-case assessment that an individual, it's safe to send an individual to Rwanda. Let's just take again my example of a lesbian, a same-sex attracted woman. You send her there, and I think the Home Secretary originally said she wasn't going to send LGBT people to Rwanda, but now we know from the documents published on Monday that you are going to send them there. But if you send a lesbian there and she finds herself discriminated against, as you've told us, there's no specific anti-discrimination laws that protect LGBT individuals in Rwanda. So how does she, what's her recourse, what's her remedy? That's what I'm asking you. Once those people have got there, if they're discriminated against, if their human rights are breached, what's their remedy? Because there's nothing in the Memorandum of Understanding. There's no anti-discrimination laws in Rwanda. So what's the remedy?
So I would again make the point that the CPIT report is clear that there is no systemic breach of human rights in Rwanda.
I'm not asking you about systemic breaches. I'm asking you about what happens if an individual we've sent there suffers a human rights breach. What's their remedy?
At what point?
After they get there, what's their remedy?
So as I've said, people within the asylum system in Rwanda will be able to access legal advice. That is built into the arrangements, that is right and proper. And of course, no doubt, people would be able to bring complaints in the usual way if they believe that they had been discriminated against or treated appallingly.
Okay. Well, we seem to have a bit of a disconnect between the advice that was given on Monday and the advice you're saying about, for example, LGBT rights in Rwanda, and the advice that we give to British citizens travelling there. So I wonder whether you would write to us about this and clarify it.
I'm very happy to take away the points that the committee has made, but I again go back to this point that overall our assessment is that there are not systemic breaches of human rights.
Okay, I think we've heard that several times now, so I think that would be the best way of having a response in writing. Joanna, do you want to ask one last question, and then I'm going to move to Lee Anderson?
So one last question, just generally based on what we're talking about. You've said that you've agreed with me that the Memorandum of Understanding is not binding under international law. So, if obligations under the assurances part of that agreement as to treatment of post-asylum decisions or access for inspection, monitoring, and provision of legal services, if they're not met, then what recourse, remedy, penalty will there be for each participant and for the UK government? And again, I think that's something you might want to write to us about.
I would again go back to the point that if there were concerns raised about the application of the partnership, it would be for ministers to decide appropriately at that given time what their response to that would be. But that is why we have these oversight arrangements in place and will have these oversight arrangements in place so that the assurance of the partnership takes place. I don't envisage those sorts of issues arising, but ministers would make appropriate decisions in the circumstances were that to arise.
Okay, thank you. Lee Anderson.
Now don't worry, I will not burden you with Lee Anderson, Tom Persglove loving, where our 30p gruel master chef basically says, "Now Tom, would you do me the great pleasure of allowing your ball sack to tickle my tonsils? Why finish with shit when you can have silk, so to speak?" Well done, Johanna Cherry, I've got to say, absolutely superb. But when he admitted that this horrendous agreement isn't bound into international law, I've got to say that did scare me a little bit. What do you guys think? Right, I shall leave the video here, and I do hope you enjoyed them and opened your eyes a little bit, because it did me, especially the question that Diane Abbott said. Really opened my eyes. But anyway, until the next time, I shall bid you farewell and have a wonderful weekend as well too, and take care.